I would like to begin this video by revealing the identity of Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was a man who lived at 20 Wirt Street, London, WC, and his name was Thomas Totson. Of that I am certain. How can I be so sure? Because Mr. Barraclough's table said he was. Mr. B. Barraclough lived in York, so he was some distance away from the epicentre of the Whitechapel murders. But at the height of the Ripper crimes, he sent a telegram to the police in London in which he urged them to watch the house at 20 Wirt Street, WC. That was it. Now, compared to some of the correspondence that was by this time finding its way into the police investigation, this one was positively brimming with sanity. So it was placed on the pile for filing in the bin at the first possible opportunity, when 2 days later Mr. Barraclough sent another telegram to explain the first. According to the second communication, a few days before he had sent his original telegram, he and his family had been enjoying a spot of table rapping, a means by which the living could communicate with the dead. Suddenly, in the midst of their rapping session, a message had come through that announced, "More murders tonight in London." Having informed them that the killer's name was Thomas Totson of 20 Wirt Street, WC, it urged them to contact the police immediately. This Mr. Barraclough had duly done. The fact that there was no such thoroughfare as Wirt Street in the WC area of London meant that the police were unable to bring Thomas Totson in for questioning, and thus the Whitechapel murderer remained at liberty. Now, to be fair to Mr. Barraclough's crime-hunting table, all sorts of possible solutions to solving the mystery of the murders were circulating by this time. The fact is that the huge amount of press coverage generated by the Whitechapel atrocities, coupled with the police's evident inability to capture the miscreant responsible for them, meant that many people felt it their moral duty to get in on the act and advise the authorities on how the killer could best be brought to book. And some of the suggestions were, to say the least, unconventional. On the 6th of October 1888, the East London Advertiser observed, "If anything were wanted to heighten the horrors of these tragedies, it is the introduction of the supernatural element." However, by then, there can be little doubt that a supernatural element had indeed been introduced to the case. On September the 6th, according to an article that appeared in the Medium and Daybreak, a weekly journal devoted to spiritualism, a seance had been held which threw some light on the Whitechapel murders. The medium, the article informed its readers, was a Mrs. C. Spring, through whom, it is stated, the spirit of Mary Ann Nichols, the third of the Whitechapel victims and the first whose remains were mutilated after death, has revisited this earth. The séance was held at the house of a Mr. Warren, 245 Kentish Town Road, London, NW. This is the premises as it appears today, now occupied by the Kentish barber. It takes a bit of imagination to picture those long-ago participants sitting behind the walls of the premises and summoning forth the spirit of Mary Ann Nichols, who, as far as we know, didn't actually have any connection with the house, nor for that matter, with Kentish Town. There were, the article continued, several persons present, and the correctness of what transpired is certified by Mr. and Mrs. Warren and 3 other witnesses. Before quoting from the proceedings, we should explain for the benefit of readers unacquainted with the spiritualistic vocabulary that the guides referred to are certain spirits who claim the medium as their own. Most mediums, we believe, have a certain number of guides who have exclusive use of the medium's powers when in the trance state to communicate with this world, and without whose consent no strange spirit can possess the medium. The date of the séance was September the 6th, 6 days after the murder of Mrs. Nichols and 1 day before the discovery of the body of Mrs. Chapman. The medium, Mrs. Spring, was controlled and appeared in great pain all over the body, as if suffering from severe wounds in the body, and she also went through the action as if cutting her throat. One of the sitters, being impressed, asked the control if it was the spirit of Mrs. Nichols, the woman who had been murdered at Whitechapel a short time ago, and the spirit answered, "Yes," adding, the fiend, I am not the only victim. There will be others yet, more before long, and of a more brutal kind. The police are asleep. In fact, it required soldiers to keep watch. There is a gang of them. 'Tis a secret society." The control also said that it was impossible for anyone present to form an opinion of her sufferings, and that she was still suffering. In fact, she could not come out of her condition at present, and asked the circle if she would be permitted to come, and all present answered yes. The control then left the meeting wishing all good night and thanking them. Another séance had been held on the 10th of September at 38 Chalcot Crescent, Primrose Hill in northwest London, with Mrs. Spring again acting as the medium. Incidentally, and as a brief aside, Chalcot Crescent might look familiar to fans of Paddington, as it was the location of the home of the Brown family in the movies. But back to the circle. During the séance, the Dundee Courier reported, the spirit of Mary Ann Nichols, who was murdered at Whitechapel, came, and on being asked by one of the sitters whether the police were on the right track, answered, "No, not yet." A gentleman asked if they would succeed in finding the murderer. She answered, "Yes, but not yet." The gentleman then remarked, "It is only too true, friend, what you foretold at Mr. Warren's on Thursday, September the 6th, for there has indeed been another poor victim to the same cruelty, and it is within 36 hours after you foretold it." The spirit answered, "Yes, there has been another victim, and there will be more yet." While under the influence, Mrs. Spring continued to describe. She said, "I see a man, medium height, dark beard, dark eyes and dark hair, thick-set with muscular arms. He has on a dark, soft felt hat slouched over his eyes. His coat and trousers are of a light colour, dressed out of the fashion of the navvy, but his face has the appearance of someone who moves in a higher grade of life. His expression is that of a foreigner. His coat is buttoned round his neck, but he has got arms in the sleeves. He has no waistcoat on, and his shirt sleeves are rolled up, and under his coat I see something bright. He wears a narrow stripe round the waist of his trousers." At this point of the vision, Mrs. Spring was fully controlled, and the control said she was Mary Ann Nichols, the murdered woman, and that the guides had found her wandering about in trouble and despair, and they had brought her to the circle that she might find some comfort. She also stated that she would not be happy until the murderers were brought to justice, not from any feeling of revenge, but purely in the interest of others, as she again repeated that there would be more victims to the diabolical plot. She would help to hunt the murderer down, and it would be one that the police little dream of. And with that, this second séance in Chalcot Crescent drew to a close. However, paranormal involvement in the Jack the Ripper case was far from over. In the aftermath of Elizabeth Stride's murder on the 30th of September, a mysterious lady named Mary Malcolm came forward and claimed that she was convinced that the murdered woman was her sister, Elizabeth Watts. Having twice viewed the body of Elizabeth Stride at the mortuary, Mary Malcolm identified her as her sister. She duly appeared at the inquest into Elizabeth Stride's death, and in the course of her testimony, the coroner questioned her about a special presentiment that she had received. In hushed tones, Mary Malcolm explained that she had been lying in bed at around 1:20 a.m. on the previous Sunday, the 30th of September, the day of the murder, when she suddenly felt a pressure on her breast, whereupon she heard 3 distinct kisses in the air around her. This, she said, made her sense that something had happened to her sister, Elizabeth Watts. Consequently, when she heard of the murder in Berners Street later that day, she contacted the police to tell them of her fears. The East London Advertiser on the 6th of October 1888 informed its readers that this was around the time that the Burner Street victim was meeting her death, and went on to opine that, since it is probable that her killer betrayed his victim Judas-like with a kiss, this would account for the 3 kisses that Mrs. Malcolm had heard. The pressure on her breast, the article explained, was consistent with where the murderer would have placed his hand to steady himself as he leant over to slit her throat. The newspaper went on to inform its readers that there were numerous records of people contacting their loved ones telepathically at times of great stress, and this, it stated, is what appears to have happened in this case. Mrs. Malcolm proceeded to paint her sister in a very unflattering light, accusing her late sibling of, amongst other things, adultery, bearing an illegitimate child by a police officer, and also hinting that she had been a prostitute. Mary Malcolm's story was finally exposed as a fabrication when her sister hobbled into court, very much alive, and denounced Mrs. Malcolm for giving her such a bad character. Mary Malcolm's motive for persisting with her elaborate yarn was never established. I've produced a full video about her, which I'll link to in the description below. What is certain, however, is that her story of the dream caught the public's imagination, and over the next few weeks, more people came forward to lend further psychic elements to the case. On the 8th of October, the Star reported on a spiritualist clue and told how, at a seance in Bolton the previous day, a medium claimed to have revealed the Whitechapel murderer. She described him as having the appearance of a farmer, though dressed like a navvy with a strap around his waist and peculiar pockets. He wears a dark moustache and bears scars behind his ear and in other places. He will, according to the medium, the article assured its readers, be caught in the act of committing another murder. On the 9th of October, the London Evening Standard added a further preternatural angle to the atrocities by suggesting that they might be linked to a German occult practice akin to the Hand of Glory. Our Vienna correspondent, telegraphing last night, states that Dr. Bloch, a member of the Austrian Reichsrat, has called his attention to certain facts which may throw a new light on the Whitechapel murders and perhaps afford some assistance in tracing the murderer. In various German criminal codes of the 17th and 18th centuries, as also in statutes of a more recent date, punishments are prescribed for the mutilation of female corpses with the object of making from the uterus and other organs the so-called thieves' candles or soporific candles. According to an old superstition, still rife in various parts of Germany, the light from such candles will throw those upon whom it falls into the deepest slumbers, and they may, consequently, become a valuable instrument to the thieving profession, hence their name. That this superstition has survived amongst German thieves to the present day was proved by a case tried as recently as 1875. In this, the body of a woman had been found mutilated in precisely the same way as were the victims of the Whitechapel murderer. Following this brief mention in the Standard, as well as in a few other daily newspapers, the suggestion that the murders were being carried out at the behest of housebreakers in order to create thieves' candles from the victims' body parts was dropped by the press, albeit stories about supernatural aspects of the case continued to appear. The Cardiff Times on Saturday the 13th of October published details of a visit to a Cardiff police station by a woman who claimed to have succeeded where the Metropolitan Police had failed and had discovered the personality and whereabouts of the Whitechapel murderer. By way of a brief clarification, the word nonce is used in this article to mean the time being. Spiritualists and the murderer, an astounding story at Cardiff. For the nonce, the centre of the interest which is attached to the terrible London tragedies of the past few weeks has been transferred from Whitechapel to Cardiff. To accomplish this remarkable state of affairs, some occult agency was evidently required, unless indeed the murderer himself had turned up in our midst. And this motive power has been supplied by the believers in spiritualism. On Saturday afternoon, a respectably dressed middle-aged woman entered the Cardiff Central Police Station and addressed herself to the officer who happened to be in charge for the moment. She informed him very seriously that she believed she had discovered the personality and whereabouts of the Whitechapel murderer, but to his sceptical mind the value of the information was considerably discounted by the fact that she avowed herself to be a spiritualist, indicating that it was by this means that the momentous disclosure had been made. However, here is the pith of her story, which we give for what it is worth. The previous evening, at the witching hour of the night, when churchyards yawn and graves give up their dead, the informant, together with 5 friends, assembled in a house in Godfrey Street, Newtown, and gathered round the mystic table. They placed their 12 hands with the fingers outstretched on the table, each of the 6 persons joining his thumbs and completing the magnetic circuit by touching with his little fingers those of his neighbours on either side. In solemn silence they sat, and the leader of the party invoked the spirit of Elizabeth Stride, who was foully done to death in Whitechapel last Sunday morning. For a time there was no response. Pale with determination, yet feeling somewhat creepy in their spinal cords, the company persevered, waiting awe-stricken for they knew not what. At last the table gave evident signs of disturbance, and after a few violent jumps in erratic directions, the magic wood gave forth the weird knocks which announced the presence of the dead among the living. "Who art thou?" queried the spokesman of the spiritualists in mechanical yet trembling tones. "Knock, knock," went the table, as it unerringly spelled out the words, "Elizabeth Stride." "By whom wert thou murdered?" was the next question. Again did the table oscillate and rap out the message, "By a man named Johnny Donnelly." And then, warming vindictively to the congenial task of giving up to justice the foul slaughterer, "He lives at number 13 Commercial Road or Street." Which of the 2 thoroughfares it was, the listeners in their excitement could not positively determine. "Did he commit all the Whitechapel murders?" "No," rapped the spirit. "He is one of a gang of 12 who have sworn to commit these crimes, and different members of the gang have done the various murders." At this juncture the current magnetism was suddenly broken, nor could it be restored. Elizabeth Stride had wandered off into the chilly night, and the party separated. The conversation above given is a verbatim record of the occurrence which was tendered to the police in all seriousness. There the matter stands. The West Somerset Free Press felt moved to comment on the involvement of the spiritualists in its edition of Saturday the 13th of October. "Those superstitious humbugs, the spiritualists, have been at it again. They are anxious to aid the police in the elucidation of the Whitechapel mystery, and hence they have had seances, 2 of them. The result of one is that the criminal stands revealed in the form of a woman. The second seance, held in a different part of the country, reveals the fact that the crimes have been committed by a man, and a very circumstantial description is given of his dress, address, and appearance. If the spiritualists could first of all agree upon the sex of the murderer, it would enhance the value of their revelations. As the matter now stands, it is rather puzzling. It is, however, valuable, a confirmation of one's belief in this system of supernatural juggling. Following the murder of Mary Kelly on the 9th of November, a rather bizarre request was made to the undertaker who had arranged for her funeral. The Manchester Courier published an account of it in its edition of Saturday the 24th of November. Lady Spiritualist's request. On Sunday evening, a venerable lady called upon Mr. Wilton, Shoreditch, London, who conducted the funeral of the woman Kelly, the latest victim of the Whitechapel murderer, and made a remarkable request. "Well," said Mr. Wilton, as the stranger silently introduced herself. "I want a lock of Mary Kelly's hair," responded the lady, "and I'm willing to pay anything for it." "Impossible, madam," and the undertaker was obdurate, in spite of his visitor's entreaties. The lady explained her mission at some length. She was acquainted, she remarked, with a female spiritualist who had been blind since she was 3 years of age. The sightless spiritualist was a strong medium, and could she but have a lock of the deceased's hair, the lady felt sure the murderer's accurate description would be revealed. The singular request, it needs scarcely be added, was not complied with, and the aged lady expressed her sorrow at the result of her visit. Perhaps the award for the most suspect supernatural suggestion should go to the man who asked the police for an item of clothing which the victims had been wearing close to their skin at the time of their murders. Apparently, he had a friend who had succeeded in bringing to justice people who were guilty of cruelty to animals when there was no other evidence to convict them, and he thought that his friend might be similarly successful in bringing the Whitechapel murderer to justice. Meanwhile, Jack the Ripper was continuing his intrusions into the slumbers of sleepers both far and wide. A clergyman in Newmarket contacted the police to tell them that he had dreamed that there were in fact two killers and that their names were Pat Murphy and Jim Slaney. His dream was most specific in that he was able to tell the police that they would be walking past 22 Gresham Street at precisely 4:10 p.m. on Wednesday the 28th of November, 1888. Would the police be kind enough to send a couple of detectives to Gresham Street at this time in order that these two perpetrators might be apprehended? Sadly, no official reports as to whether the police actually followed up on the request have survived. In July and August 1889, newspapers far and wide gave a great deal of coverage to a dream that Stuart Cumberland, a celebrated thought reader of the age, had had. Stuart Cumberland was famous for performing blindfolded feats, such as identifying a hidden object in a room that a person had picked out, or asking someone to imagine a murder scene and then attempting to read the subject's thoughts and identify the victim and reenact the crime. The following account of his dream appeared in the Star on Tuesday the 6th of August, 1889. A thought reader's dream of Jack the Ripper. Mr. Stuart Cumberland, the thought reader, has dreamt dreams and seen visions of the Whitechapel murderer. He publishes a portrait of the gentleman in the current number of the Mirror. Mr. Cumberland thus describes the murderer's face. It was thinnish and oval in shape. The eyes were dark and prominent, showing plenty of white. The brow was narrow and the chin somewhat pointed. The complexion was sallow. The nose was somewhat Semitic in shape and formed a prominent feature of the face. The formation of the mouth I could not very well see. It was shaded by a black moustache. Beyond the hair on the upper lip, the face was bare. It was not a particularly disagreeable face, but there was a wild intensity about the dark, full eyes that fascinated me as I gazed into them. They were the eyes of a mesmerist. The man of my dream wore a short-crowned chimney-pot hat. He stooped in his shoulders, and although there was a wiry look about such portion of his figure that was visible to me, he did not have the appearance of a man of muscular build. Mr. Stuart Cumberland thinks the assassin will commit yet another murder, the 9th, and will then be caught. A little time later, the East London Observer gave its readers a glimpse of the type of mail that was arriving on the desk of Superintendent Arnold at Leman Street Police Station. There are, for instance, it told its readers, no end of letters from spiritualists and thought readers who profess in some cases to have seen the spirits of one or other of the murdered women with whom they have entered into conversation as to the appearance of the murderer. The striking disparities evident, however, are sufficient on the face of them to condemn the letters and their writers as being absolutely useless for all practical purposes. Meanwhile, in Edinburgh, a resident of Queen's Crescent found his repose disturbed by visions of the Whitechapel murderer, as the St. James Gazette reported on Thursday the 12th of September. Strange dreams. Mr. T. Ross Scott, residing at 26 Queen's Crescent, which is situated in one of the fashionable suburbs of Edinburgh, has given publicity to a peculiar dream which he had on Tuesday morning of the Whitechapel murderer, and says that it is the third occasion on which the same figure has presented itself to him in his dreams, and it has accordingly made a deep impression upon him. While residing at Burnt Island during the month of July, 2 of my remarkable dreams took place. The first occasion on which I saw the vision was during the night of Thursday, July the 4th. The figure was standing in what appeared to me to be a small dispensary, but I was unable to note any of the details because the man, whom I supposed to be the ship's surgeon, had his eyes fixed on me, and I seemed quite powerless to withdraw mine from his gaze. Just then, however, I awoke, and my dream came to an end. About a fortnight afterwards, on the morning of the 8th murder, the vision again appeared to me. Mr. Scott afterwards had his attention drawn to the Mirror of the 29th of July, in which the editor, Mr. Stuart Cumberland, gave an account of a vision in which the face of a man claiming to be the author of the murders presented itself. Upon opening the paper, Mr. Scott instantly recognized the portrait as being that of the man he had seen in his dreams. With the exception of the colour of the moustache, the description tallied in every respect. Since then, it had been reported in the Mirror that the vision of the same face had appeared to a lady, and that lady had subsequently seen the man of her dreams sitting in a fashionable London church during evening service. Mr. Scott gives the following account of his dream of Tuesday morning. Retired to bed at 1:30 this morning, but for a long while lay quite awake. The last thing I remember was looking at my watch, the hands of which pointed to 5 minutes to 3. I then fell asleep. Gradually buildings seemed to rise on every side, and I appeared to be walking along a somewhat broad street, the features of which, however, I was unable to see distinctly owing to the darkness of the night. While proceeding on my way, I became conscious of the presence of someone, and glancing up, observed a tall, dark figure rapidly approaching me. In his right hand the stranger held a large carpet bag, which apparently he had considerable difficulty in carrying. As he passed, he turned his head towards me, and I immediately recognized him as the surgeon of my previous dreams. In vain I tried to reach him. He again had his eyes fixed on me. I was totally unable to move. Just then I awoke, struggling violently and completely exhausted. The time by my watch was 11 minutes past 5. The account of Mr. Scott's dreams prompted a letter to the spiritualist journal Light from a correspondent in Aberdeen, which was published on the 19th of October. Visions of the Night. The writer stated that he had recently put a young lad by the name of Alec Urquhart under magnetic influence. I had put him to sleep for the purpose of giving some clairvoyant tests to a sceptical friend, the correspondent stated, but instead of answering my questions, he began to tell us about a tall, dark gentleman whom he saw opening a black bag which he carried in his hand. The bag contained some clothing, and what appeared to the lad to be a number of surgical instruments, some of which the man examined, wiped, and replaced in the bag or put in his pocket. He said there were 3 initials on the bag, which he read, and on being directed to ask the gentleman for his name, he repeated it in full without the slightest hesitation. His address and profession, surgeon, were obtained with the same readiness. Having changed part of his attire from the bag, the man made his way into the city to a certain hotel, the name and number of which were given. The letter went on to state that the clairvoyant affirmed that he was the real criminal and that he had recently murdered a pretty dark-complexioned woman at the back of some stables near a foundry about Whitechapel Lane. Carrying his mind back, he could also trace him to a small red-tiled house some distance from Whitechapel, where he saw him with the mutilated body of a woman before him. He gave a pretty clear description of the place and the proceedings of the man who, when he left the house, washed his hands at a well nearby and made his way to a certain bar near Mitre Square, where he had some drink. The correspondent went on to reveal that 2 weeks later he had put the young man to sleep again along with another gentleman, Mr. Paul, who is also, he wrote, a developing medium. Both of them soon manifested very distressing symptoms as they passed away from my immediate control, he continued. The lad was disturbed, as he told us, through being compelled to witness the perpetration of one of those horrible tragedies attributed to Jack the Ripper in all its sickening details by the same man he had told us of on a former occasion. Mr. Paul was evidently being controlled by the spirit of the victim, but so acutely painful did the physical manifestations become that In spite of all efforts to soothe him, he had to be wakened up almost immediately when he said his experience was the worst he had ever endured, and that in fact he could not have withstood it much longer. He had felt exactly what some of Jack the Ripper's unfortunate victims must have experienced as their bodies underwent mutilation. I should much like to know the result of any similar attempt to trace this murderer. I cannot see why a tried subject, a clairvoyant or a good medium, should not be able to do something to assist in his discovery. Aberdeen, J.C. That the police were approached by several clairvoyants who offered information on the crimes was attested to by Superintendent Alfred Foster of the City of London Police, who mentioned the fact in an interview he gave to the Pall Mall Gazette upon his retirement from the force in May 1892. Foster revealed that he had been interviewed by eminent spiritualists and others on the subject of Jack the Ripper's Mitre Square tragedy, the murder of Catherine Eddowes on the 30th of September 1888. Apparently, these interviews had given him a great deal of hope at different times of lighting upon some clue. But, he lamented, they have completely failed. In fact, he observed wryly, that crime is as great a mystery today as ever it was. It would be remiss of me to end this video without mentioning the most famous medium to have involved himself in the case, Robert James Lees. I say most famous because he is the one that has most often been depicted in films and television dramas on the case. Donald Sutherland, for example, played him in the film Murder by Decree. According to Lees's diary, in October 1888, he approached both the Metropolitan and City of London Police to offer his assistance in the hunt for Jack the Ripper. However, according to an article about him that appeared in the Boston Sunday Post in 1895, as they regarded him as nothing short of a lunatic and had been for some months visited by all sorts and conditions of cranks with Jack the Ripper theories, he naturally received little attention. An article that appeared in several other American newspapers in May 1895 claimed that Lees had been troubled by premonitions of Jack the Ripper carrying out his atrocities, and on each occasion these psychic visions came true. I felt almost as if I was an accessory before the fact, he was quoted as observing in the Boston Sunday Post. It made such an impression upon me that my whole nervous system was seriously shaken. I could not sleep at night, and, under the advice of a physician, I removed with my family to the continent. On his return to London, the article continued, one day, while riding in an omnibus from Shepherd's Bush in company with his wife, he experienced a renewal of the strange sensations which had preceded his former clairvoyant condition. The omnibus ascended Notting Hill. It stopped at the top, and a man entered the interior of the vehicle. Mr. Lees at once experienced a singular sensation. Looking up, he perceived that the new passenger was a man of medium size. He noticed that he was dressed in a dark suit of Scotch tweed, over which he wore a light overcoat. He had a soft felt hat on his head. Over a year had elapsed since Mr. Lees's clairvoyant vision, but the picture of the murderer had been indelibly impressed upon his mind. Leaning over to his wife, he remarked earnestly, "That is Jack the Ripper." His wife laughed at this and told him not to be foolish. "I am not mistaken," replied Lees. "I feel it." The man left the bus at Marble Arch, and Lees followed him. He even stopped a constable whom he encountered to denounce the man as the Whitechapel murderer, but the constable merely laughed at him and threatened to run him in. At this point, apparently sensing he was in danger, the Ripper jumped into a cab and was driven off at rapid speed along Piccadilly. After further murders, the police, so the article claimed, began to take Lees seriously, and he consented to lead them on a nighttime psychic hunt through the streets of London in an attempt to track the Ripper. At last, at 4 o'clock in the morning, with pale face and bloodshot eyes, the human bloodhound halted at the gates of a West End mansion, gasping with cracked and swollen lips as he pointed to an upper chamber where a faint light gleamed. "There is the murderer, the man you are looking for," he told the accompanying detectives. "It is impossible," returned the inspector. "That is the residence of one of the most celebrated physicians in the West End." On being found in incriminating circumstances, the Chicago Herald told its readers, the doctor was put in a lunatic asylum under the name of Thomas Mason 124 and a mock funeral held. According to the Herald, the tale had been related by a Dr. Howard of London, who when drunk had told the story to a man who then told the newspaper. It is interesting to note that although the story received wide coverage in American newspapers, the British press, with a handful of exceptions, gave it no coverage whatsoever. In fact, it has long been regarded as nothing more than a hoax, with Melvin Harris in his book Jack the Ripper, The Bloody Truth, attributing it to the Whitechapel Club of Chicago. However, the idea of a medium being plagued by visions of the Whitechapel murders and leading the police to a highly respected London doctor who is revealed to be the most infamous criminal of all time is a compelling one, and it has been trotted out time after time in films, TV dramas, books and newspaper articles, despite there being little to no evidence that it ever happened. The involvement of spiritualists, clairvoyants and thought readers in attempting to solve the mystery is real, however, and adds just another intriguing aspect to the saga. And lest we be tempted to assign such involvement to the pages of history, it is worth noting that several modern television programs have visited the scenes of the crimes in order to see if mediums can finally bring the perpetrator to justice, whilst several locations around the district regularly feature on nighttime ghost hunts carried out by paranormal investigation groups. There is no doubt about it, despite the passage of more than a century, the hunt for Jack the Ripper, both in this world and the next, will continue for many years yet.